Having lost her job, the doctor came to the grave of the rich man she had failed to save. Upon overhearing a conversation between two foreigners, she pretended not to understand. Dorothy's mood couldn't have been worse, and understandably so. Not every day do you get fired because your patient passed away after treatment. The head of the department was shouting and stomping, threatening to take legal action. The chief physician was more modest in his threats, but told Dorothy straight away that there was no avoiding dismissal. "But how is this possible, Mr. Warren? I followed all the procedures and the prescribed medication is absolutely safe." "It can all be double-checked," Dorothy explained, barely holding back tears. The chief physician shook his head. "I don't know how you treated him, but the results speak for themselves. Anyway, prepare for the worst. Also, the police will come to take statements from you, so think it through and don't blabber unnecessarily. Now go to the accounting department and process everything properly." Dorothy nodded and left the office. Right now, all she wanted was to cover her face with her hands and cry out loud. Today of all days was the funeral of her patient, Scott Reynolds. Although most likely they had already taken place, that didn't change the essence of things. After receiving her severance pay and a reprimand from management, Dorothy went straight to the cemetery to pay her respects to the deceased. As a hematologist, she had treated him for poor blood clotting, and Scott had died for reasons unknown. In general, everything happened so quickly. What did the autopsy show? Who was to blame? Dorothy never got an answer to that question. Who would argue with her when the guilt was evident? It was after her treatment that this businessman ended up in the cemetery. Calling a taxi one way, Dorothy bought a mourning wreath on the way and another bouquet of carnations with an even number of flowers. She saw Reynolds' grave from afar. It was in such a place that it could be seen well. A pile of wreaths, flowers, and a massive oak cross with a photo of the deceased and a plaque. To Dorothy's surprise, there were two men dressed in black at the grave. The funeral took place an hour or so ago. What were they doing here? Although, well, what silly questions she asks herself. It's clear, just like her, they came to accompany the businessman on his final journey. Dorothy timidly nodded to the strangers and laid the flowers on the grave. Then she placed the wreath to the side and bowed her head in silent grief. At that moment, Dorothy heard foreign speech behind her. So that's why this couple in black behaved awkwardly. They were foreigners. Well, what's so surprising about that? Probably some business partners or investors. By a strange twist of fate, Dorothy knew this language, not perfectly, of course, but she could make out something. She even won contests, much to her teacher's delight. Against her will, Dorothy began to distinguish familiar words in the foreign speech, but what she heard made her uncomfortable. "I wonder if this fool knows who exactly she's grieving for," said the first of the men, who apparently was older and had more weight in business circles. "How could she know? Just look at her, a plain Jane," chuckled the second. Dorothy's cheeks burned with shame. What do these foreigners think they're doing, coming to the cemetery and giggling like they're at a circus? Everything was organized perfectly. "I even liked it," said the first man. "As they say here, without a hitch." "And a hitch," remarked the second, deciding not to show that she understood their language. Dorothy sorrowfully knelt in front of the grave. The pungent smell of carnations and damp soil made her head spin. At that moment, the foreigners muttered something final and headed toward the exit. Dorothy turned around, giving them a disdainful look. The elderly caretaker stepped out of the guardhouse and waved to her warmly. Dorothy nodded uncertainty, still not understanding why this man's face seemed familiar to her. She wanted to approach closer when she heard a strange noise. "My goodness, what is that?" Dorothy shuddered. At first, the sound seemed to her like a moan, but who could be moaning in the cemetery? Although maybe someone from the grieving relatives was crying. Anyway, the place was very sad. Dorothy looked around but didn't see anyone. Then the moan came, not from nowhere, but from the ground itself. Oh my God, what is this? Ignoring the claws falling from the grave mound, Dorothy knelt down and listened. Everything was accurate. The sound clearly came from somewhere deep in the grave. But how was that possible? For a moment, she thought it was just her imagination born of mournful thoughts. But then a weak moan sounded, which could not be mistaken for anything else. Dorothy's heart beat anxiously. The moan repeated. True, this time it carried unbearable pain and despair. Without hesitation, Dorothy ran to the caretaker's guardhouse. "Please help," she shouted, knocking on the door. "I urgently need your help." The door creaked softly, and a slender elderly man appeared on the threshold, wearing worn-out boots and a washed-out jacket. "What happened, Miss?" he asked in a slightly hoarse voice. "I heard a moan there," Dorothy blurted out, unable to hide the trembling in her voice. "I think it's coming from a fresh grave." To be honest, the caretaker had long been accustomed to strange cemetery stories, trying not to pay attention to them. But Dorothy's case somehow intrigued the elderly man. He sighed sadly and said he would go with her, taking a shovel and a flashlight. As dusk was approaching, he stepped out of the guardhouse. "Where did you hear the moan?" he asked, looking around. At that moment, even the caretaker's voice seemed vaguely familiar to Dorothy. Where had she heard it before, and why was this man looking at her so strangely? She led him towards Scott's grave, and the caretaker obediently followed her, glancing around anxiously. When they reached the right place, Dorothy pointed to the grave. "Here, I definitely heard the moan." Without saying a word, the caretaker knelt down and listened. Fear flashed in the man's eyes, and he began to dig. Despite his age, the caretaker worked quickly, his shovel forcefully plunging into the fresh soil. Dorothy also helped as much as she could, scooping up the soil with a smaller shovel that the gravediggers had apparently forgotten. Meanwhile, the caretaker and Dorothy kept hearing strange sounds coming from under the ground. After half an hour, when the burial site was almost completely excavated, they saw that the lacquered lid of the coffin had cracked. "Oh, it looks like the relatives of the deceased were fooled by the funeral home again," the elderly man remarked sadly. "They were given a defective lid and concealed the defects under the lacquer." At that moment, his voice reminded Dorothy of something again. Meanwhile, the caretaker descended into the grave and pushed back the lid. "Scott, is that you?" whispered Dorothy, horrified, peering into the darkness of the coffin. She expected to see the body of her former patient, but instead saw a completely unfamiliar man dressed in simple, worn-out clothes. He lay at the bottom of the coffin, pale and with half-closed eyes. The stranger's lips moved, and sweat glistened on his forehead. "Oh my God," whispered the caretaker, peering. "He's alive." The man lying in the coffin slowly opened his eyes. He sat up on his elbows and looked around anxiously. "Where am I?" he croaked, grabbing the edges of the coffin. "Am I in a grave or already on the other side? Is everything happening there exactly like this?" "We need to call an ambulance," Dorothy said, noticeably worried. "He's in shock, and besides, this isn't Scott Reynolds." The caretaker flinched and then helped the man out of the grave. The stranger looked scared, still not understanding what had happened to him. "I don't know how I got here," he said anxiously. "I was offered a temporary job. I came for an interview, and I don't remember anything else. My head is just pounding and spinning." "Who are you?" the caretaker asked, struggling to contain his concern. "What's your name?" "Eden," the man replied. "Eden Parks." The caretaker and Dorothy exchanged glances. To tell the truth, they were shocked. The grave that was supposed to hold the body of businessman Reynolds contained a completely different living person. It was simply impossible. "How did you get here?" Dorothy asked. "Did you know the deceased?" "No, I didn't know him," Ethan replied. "I've never heard that name before." "Wait, I remember now. They asked me to substitute for gravediggers in the funeral team." I agreed. I really needed the job. The last thing I remember is a closed coffin standing on a pedestal. "So what's going on? I can't understand what happened to me." Dorothy shook her head. She didn't know the answer to that question. She also felt growing concern. She looked at the caretaker, who had already turned on the flashlight, illuminating the area around them. At that moment, Dorothy remembered where she had seen him before. "Yes, he was my high school foreign language teacher, Mr. Cobb," she whispered. "Is it really you?" The caretaker smiled. "Well, you finally remembered me, Briggs. I recognized you right away. You haven't changed a bit, but I, you see, have aged and become thin. I was a teacher, and now I'm a caretaker in the cemetery." Tears welled up in Dorothy's eyes. Mr. Cobb was her favorite teacher in school. He had instilled in her a love for foreign languages and helped her believe in herself, becoming one of the top students in school. "I see a familiar face but couldn't remember right away," Dorothy said, feeling guilty. The caretaker waved his hand. "Oh, come on, forget it. It's in the past. Right now we need to help this man." "This is very strange. I've never seen anything like it," he added. Meanwhile, Ethan, still in shock, was nervously pacing around the grave. Dorothy took him by the hand, hoping to calm him down. "Don't worry. Everything will be fine. We'll call an ambulance now, and everything will be clear." Ethan looked at her with bewilderment. "No, I don't need an ambulance, and I don't want the police either. I don't understand what's happening, and to be honest, I don't want to deal with law enforcement. Who knows what I've been dragged into? What if I got involved in something unpleasant?" Fortunately, the caretaker suggested a solution, sensing Ethan's strong anxiety. He invited Ethan to his place. There he gave him some water and helped him settle on a cot. "Stay here for now, and I'll bury the grave back." Whoever did this, they wanted everything to stay as it is. "I think we should do the same. Who knows what this deceased businessman got himself into?" Ethan nodded in agreement, but his gaze remained empty. Meanwhile, Dorothy returned to the grave and took some photos, capturing the excavated grave and the empty coffin with the cracked lid. She made sure to include everything related specifically to Scott Reynolds in the frame. The cross with the photograph and plaque, as well as the wreaths with inscriptions and mourning name ribbons. Then she helped Mr. Cobb bury the grave back so that everything looked as it did before. "Ever since I graduated from medical school, I've been working at the clinic. I'm sorry I haven't visited you earlier, Mr. Cobb. After high school, our whole class sort of disappeared," she murmured, feeling embarrassed. Mr. Cobb nodded sadly. "I often thought about you. You were one of my best students. I always knew you'd become either a great translator or an excellent doctor. I'm proud of you, Di." After finishing with the grave, they sat down at a nearby table. Dorothy felt no fear whatsoever, as if she weren't in a cemetery in the shadow of the swiftly approaching dusk. Mr. Cobb told her a sad story. As it turned out, his only son had died in a car accident several years ago. His daughter-in-law, with whom Mr. Cobb had never really gotten along, kicked him out of the house after her husband's death. Now he practically lived here in the caretaker's lodge, cut off from his grandchildren, whom he was strictly forbidden to see. Dorothy listened to her former teacher with a mixture of sympathy and pity. How cruel this woman treated her own relative. "Why did she treat you like this?" Dorothy asked at the end, when Mr. Cobb finished his story. "Is your daughter-in-law really so cold and heartless?" I think she's just afraid I'll take her grandchildren away, Mr. Cobb replied bitterly. At that moment, Dorothy suddenly realized that his daughter-in-law was probably an insecure woman who was desperately trying to build her own life. But you couldn't treat your own relative like that. You should fight for your rights, Mr. Cobb, Dorothy said decisively. You have the right to see your grandchildren. It's not just your right, but also the children's right to see their grandfather. Mr. Cobb shook his head. It's easier said than done. I don't have the money for a good lawyer, and the cheaper ones are only interested in profiting from someone else's misfortune. Don't worry, said Dorothy. I'll try to solve your problem. I don't know how yet, but I'll figure it out. Daddy, you're my savior. I don't even know how to thank you. You don't need to, Mr. Cobb replied. You're my favorite teacher, and it's an honor for me to help you, Dorothy said emotionally, hugging him. At that moment, there was a special bond between them, the bond of teacher and student that transcended the boundaries of time and united them during a chance encounter in the cemetery. Returning to the lodge in the darkness, Mr. Cobb gave Daddy and Ethan some aromatic tea. Then he told them a couple of amusing stories from his past. For a while, they even cheered up Dorothy, making her forget about her own problems. Ethan, however, sat in silence, lost in sad thoughts. To be honest, he still couldn't understand what had happened to him. Why was he in someone else's grave, and why did his head hurt so much? And where did the deceased disappear to? Even though Ethan himself didn't see him, where was he? Remembering the incident with the foreigners, Dorothy told her teacher about it. After listening to the phrases in the original language, the elderly caretaker praised his former student for her excellent translation and then fell into thought. After all, what happened today clearly exceeded the bounds of normalcy. Time flew by unnoticed, and when Dorothy was about to call a taxi, she suddenly felt that she couldn't leave Ethan alone in the caretaker's lodge. Ethan, do you have anywhere to go? Somewhere to rest and recover? Dorothy asked cautiously. He shrugged uncertainly. Not really. I guess I came from the provinces for work, but like many others, I fell victim to scammers. They didn't pay me and took away my passport. They even threatened that if anything happened, they'd write me off at the bottom of the river forever. I haven't been back home for 5 years. I argued with my parents when I left, so I couldn't go back. You shouldn't disrespect your parents, buddy. After all, they gave you life, Mr. Cobb objected. Ethan nodded in agreement. Yeah, I get it. It's just shameful to go back as a failure. I even wanted to get married when I joined the army, but the bride didn't wait. Although I don't blame her, the local farmer's son will have more money than me. 6 months before coming back home, Emily wrote me a letter. It said something like, I'm getting married. Don't judge me harshly. It's easy for her to say, but I almost jumped into the river out of grief. It was a good thing my buddy stopped me and tied me up with felts. It was tough, but I got over it. When I returned from the army, Emily had already given birth, a beautiful boy. I felt envious, so I decided to go to the city to change my life, not to be a laughingstock. Mr. Cobb and Dorothy exchanged meaningful glances, and then Dorothy asked, So, what have you decided, Ethan? Are you coming with me or what? The taxi is already on its way. Ethan shook his head. No, I'll stay here with Mr. Cobb. I'll recover a bit, and then we'll see. There's always work at the cemetery. I won't starve. The elderly teacher visibly brightened up. Of course, stay, son. It'll be livelier for me too, instead of being alone at night, dreaming of crosses and graves. Dorothy smiled and opened the door of the lodge. There was a car waiting by the gate, flashing its headlights invitingly. All right then, I'll go. I wrote down the phone number on a piece of paper and left it on the table. Call if you need anything, and I'll try to find out something. I'll visit in a few days. Just be careful, okay? "Sure, Daddy, of course," the caretaker replied, hugging her goodbye. Approaching the gate, Dorothy turned and waved her hand to Mr. Cobb and Ethan. They waved back, and as she walked to the taxi, she felt a constant surge of love and gratitude towards this elderly and wise man who had once been her teacher and had now become a friend and mentor. Seeing a noticeable emblem on the windshield, Dorothy felt an inexplicable surge of pity and compassion. The taxi driver was disabled. After giving her the address, she leaned back in her seat. The taxi driver nodded and smoothly pulled away. The streets shouted in night, fog flew past, and Dorothy, tired from the day, dreamed only of a hot bath and a soft bed. The salon was filled with pleasant half-light, illuminated only by the faint glow of the dashboard. To pass the time, Dorothy listened to the sound of the tires on the asphalt and looked out the window, observing the passing silhouettes of high buildings. At that moment, she felt completely drained, as if life had squeezed all the juices out of her. The driver sat in silence. Dorothy noticed that the man was indeed a double amputee, and outside the car, he probably moved around in a wheelchair. His car was equipped with a special mechanism that allowed him to control it manually. "Sorry," Dorothy suddenly said. "I guess I'm not a very good passenger. I'm silent all the time." The driver smiled, and she immediately understood that it was a genuine smile, not just an attempt to be polite. "No," the taxi driver replied. "Are you just feeling a little down? Is everything okay with you?" Dorothy nodded uncertainly. "Well, how can I say? I got fired from my job today, and I spent several hours at the cemetery. In general, it's been a tough day." The taxi driver didn't answer and turned on quiet music, instantly making the atmosphere in the car cozier. "I'm Eric, by the way," he said, turning his head towards her. "What's your name?" "Dorothy," she replied. "I'm tired today, although with my profession, I guess that's not surprising." "Are you a doctor?" Eric asked. Dorothy raised her eyebrows in surprise. She hadn't expected the driver to be so perceptive. "Yes, you're right," she agreed. "How did you guess?" The driver smiled. "Well, your hands are very well groomed, and you don't have a tan. That means you spend a lot of time indoors, and there's a noticeable scent of medication coming from your clothes. It's elementary, as they say." Dorothy coughed awkwardly. "Well, I could have been a nurse or medical assistant. Why specifically a doctor?" Eric shifted gears, then shrugged. "Well, why not? I read it in your gaze, probably. It's confident, although a bit tired. That kind of look is often seen in people endowed with certain authority. Maybe not much, but still." "And what about you?" Dorothy cautiously asked, then hesitated. "I mean before I lost my legs," Eric said, then immediately answered, "I was in the police force once, during the arrest of a particularly dangerous criminal." In short, Eric fell silent, and Dorothy understood that he didn't want to remember what had happened. It wasn't just the loss of his legs that hurt him, but also the memories of his past. "I'm sorry," she said. "I shouldn't have brought up this topic." "Maybe," Eric agreed, "but you can't change the past. I don't regret what happened. I found my path, and now I help people in a different way. 7 years ago, the criminal we were apprehending turned out to be my former classmate. I pursued him, but he didn't pity me. He rammed my car and escaped onto the highway. They caught him later, and it took them an hour to extricate me from the wrecked car." Dorothy looked at the driver with respect. "You're a very strong person. I'm sure your life has meaning. Just be yourself and don't give up." Nodding affirmatively, Eric stopped the car by the entrance. "Don't worry, I won't give up. I'll save up for prosthetics and join a sports club so I can participate in competitions, the ones they hold for people with disabilities." Dorothy smiled back at him, feeling that her world would never be the same. Goodbye, Eric, she said, getting out of the car. Thank you for the ride. Keep the change. Let it be my contribution to realizing your dream. Goodbye, he replied. Take care, and here, take my business card. You never know when it might come in handy. Taking a deep breath of the fresh night air, Dorothy walked towards her home. Right now, all she wanted was to sleep. Although, no, first a hot bath and then sleep. After her divorce, Dorothy lived in a modest one-bedroom apartment, as her husband took the four-bedroom apartment they bought together in an elite district. Dorothy was left with a paltry sum to buy new housing, like a bone thrown to a hungry dog. Brian considered this exchange fair, and the lawyers he hired arranged everything in such a way that Dorothy couldn't prove her contribution to buying the apartment. But back then, she had bigger things on her mind than family squabbles. It just so happened that a month before the divorce, she miscarried again. At one point, Dorothy even caught herself thinking that if she hadn't lost the baby, she might have been able to keep her husband. But fate had its own plans, and Dorothy was completely unprepared for the divorce. How could she have known that Brian had long been having an affair with his secretary, Ruby? That leggy beauty didn't waste any time. She promptly got pregnant by her influential boss. However, Dorothy didn't blame her for it. If you can bear a child, then go ahead, she thought, especially if your suitor insists on it. Finding out about the addition to her ex-husband's family, Dorothy bought several sets of baby clothes out of pure kindness and had them delivered to Brian and Ruby's home by courier. She never received a response from Brian and Ruby, but was that really a loss? Let them live on without knowing sorrow. After taking a bath, she didn't even bother with dinner. She fell asleep as soon as her face touched the pillow. The stress she had experienced earlier was definitely taking its toll. After all, it's not every day that you get fired because a patient you treated died right after being discharged. And when you come to the cemetery in grief and sorrow to ask him for forgiveness, only to find out that instead of that patient, an unknown vagrant is buried in the grave. Despite her extreme fatigue, Dorothy slept very restlessly, constantly waking up in cold sweat. She repeatedly saw the cracked lid of a coffin from which muffled moans could be heard. What if they hadn't made it in time to Mr. Cobb's? What if Aita had suffocated in that coffin due to lack of oxygen? There were so many intricacies and nuances that definitely couldn't have come together without divine intervention. Of course, Dorothy didn't consider herself an atheist. She understood that there was something in the world that we couldn't comprehend. But still, what had happened today at the cemetery could only be called a miracle. She dreamed of hospital wards, crowds of patients asking for her help. Dorothy also saw hundreds of foreign words written in a familiar Gothic font in her dreams. Who were these foreigners in the cemetery? And why were they behaving so provocatively? She didn't know the answer to this question, just like she didn't know where Scott Reynolds had disappeared to. Waking up once again in the middle of the night from the intrusive vision, Dorothy tried to put two and two together and understand what had really happened. At that moment, Scott's face, the mysterious patient from the hematology department, surfaced in her memory again. A businessman, so to speak, from the upper echelons of society. Compared to the rest of the wealthy patients, he seemed too healthy and too wealthy for a typical patient of the First City Clinic. Dorothy, being an experienced doctor, immediately suspected something was amiss. When Scott was admitted to the ward, his symptoms were vague and contradictory. Headaches, abdominal spasms, shortness of breath. Everything indicated a serious health problem, but the results of the tests and examinations showed that he was absolutely healthy, or rather, conditionally healthy. Because if desired, anyone could find something in a person's medical history requiring immediate treatment. As the days went by, Dorothy became more and more convinced of her suspicion. Scott was faking his illness, claiming at every turn that he had poor blood clotting. Scott's story about a mysterious hereditary curse plaguing his family seemed downright naive. According to the businessman, his father and grandfather had the same problems with blood clotting. But Dorothy didn't buy it. Of course, there were minor nuances, but none of them warranted hospitalization. His expensive suit, exclusive cologne, and expensive smartphone clearly didn't match the image of a dying man. That's when Dorothy secretly began her own investigation. Well, not like in a suspenseful detective story, much simpler. She asked one person, then another. When you're a specialist doctor, your circle of acquaintances is quite extensive. So, besides everything else, Dorothy learned that Scott owed serious people a large sum of money. What if the statement about illness became Reynolds' almost only opportunity to hide from persistent creditors? Dorothy wrestled with a moral dilemma. Should she inform the management about her suspicions or not? Although considering that the department head personally allocated a paid private room with a TV and air conditioning to the businessman, on the other hand, Scott blatantly deceived her and other doctors, diverting their attention from real patients in need of urgent care. One evening during rounds, Dorothy found herself face to face with him. Her voice was calm and firm, but her eyes shot lightning. "Scott," Dorothy began, "I know you're lying to everyone about your illness." In the blink of an eye, the businessman's expression changed, replaced by confusion and fear of exposure. From his chubby cheeks, the redness vanished, replaced by a cunning sparkle in his eyes. At that moment, Scott realized his game was up. Finus corin et opus, as they say. On the same day, Dorothy reported her findings to the hospital management, and Scott was discharged the next day, supposedly cured. But Dorothy couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction that justice had finally prevailed. Not only had she helped expose the fraudster, but also defended the reputation of her hospital, providing invaluable service to genuine patients. Yet it didn't take long for that plump businessman to die, and according to the department head and chief physician, it was Dorothy's fault. Of course, she tried to prove her innocence, but it was all in vain. Moreover, no one took into account the fact that the deceased businessman had manipulated everyone he could shortly before his death. In the end, only Dorothy Briggs suffered, being dismissed for reasons unclear to everyone. Although many whispered behind her back that she had discharged the patient prematurely, triggering irreversible processes in his body. Oh, for heaven's sake, what processes? He was as healthy as a bull, wasn't he? They brought him food from the restaurant 3 times a day. Can a sick person have such an appetite? Dorothy struggled to hold back tears as she spoke, but Mr. Warren just shook his head. "That's none of your business anymore, Briggs. Pray it doesn't go to court, otherwise you might just lose your medical license for life. No, I'll take you on as a janitor. Of course, after all, you're not a complete stranger, but don't expect more than that." "Well, thanks. You're a real lifesaver, aren't you?" Dorothy said, slamming the door on her way out. Thinking about it now, she couldn't hold back her tears. How could they treat her so cruelly? Why did Reynolds die? And where was his body? Outside, dawn was breaking, flooding the room with soft light. With the first rays of the sun came a feeling of relief and tranquility. Dorothy knew she had done the right thing and that she would always be guided by higher values in her work: honesty and compassion. The situation with Scott would surely be clarified. She just needed to wait a little longer. Aiken spent the night at the cemetery keeper's house. He woke up rested and full of energy. Mr. Cobb didn't press the vagrant about his past or try to learn his story. He simply provided warmth, food, and shelter, and he also promised that Eden could stay with him until he found his place in this restless world. In the morning, a light fog settled over the cemetery, enveloping everything in a gray haze, making the graves indistinguishable from each other. Mr. Cobb emerged from the guardhouse and immediately felt the damp cold penetrate his shirt. "Good morning, Aiden," he said, seeing the resident follow him. "Good morning, Mr. Cobb. The weather isn't great today, although the sun should come out by lunchtime," he replied. Mr. Cobb looked at him with a special glint in his eyes. "I see you're feeling better already," he said. "Just make sure to eat plenty. You'll need the strength to fully recover." Eden nodded and went back into the guardhouse, leaving Andrew Cobb alone with his thoughts. The elderly caretaker walked through the cemetery, checking the alleys and graves out of long-established habit. In some places, he stopped, clearing the memorials of fallen leaves or dust. Sometimes he even pulled out weeds when he saw that the deceased relatives hadn't visited in a long time. To some extent, Cobb felt at home here among the graves and mausoleums. It was always calm and quiet, sometimes even too much so. Suddenly, Mr. Cobb heard someone crying. The caretaker stopped, listening. The sound was coming from behind two small birch trees surrounding a recently laid-to-rest grave. The young woman was crying. Mr. Cobb approached closer and at that moment saw a 6-year-old boy dressed in dirty pants and an old sweater. The boy held a small child's shovel in his hands, diligently digging the earth at the grave. Meanwhile, the little one was crying, his eyes red from tears. "Good morning, buddy," Mr. Cobb said softly. "What are you doing here, and why are you crying?" The boy flinched and, noticing the caretaker, dropped the shovel from his hands. "I want to see my mom," he whispered, looking at the grave covered with withered flowers. At that moment, Mr. Cobb understood. This boy came here to say goodbye to his mother. "Your mom is in another world now," Mr. Cobb said, "where there's no sadness, pain, or tears." "I know," the boy said, wiping dirty tears off his face. "But I really want to see her. What if she's cold or hungry there? And I have a bun with me?" Mr. Cobb squatted down next to him. "Well, you can leave something for your mom to eat," he said, "something that she'll surely like in the afterlife." "But I have nothing except the bun," the boy cried. Mr. Cobb looked at the boy with undisguised pity and sympathy. "Then leave the bun," he said. "Your mom already knows that you love her very much." The boy took out a bun from his pocket, turned it over in his hands, and gently pressed it to his chest. Seeing this, the caretaker realized that the boy understood the value of bread and food in general. "Can I leave it on the grave myself?" he asked, looking at Mr. Cobb. "Of course," Mr. Cobb replied. The boy nodded and placed the bun at the foot of the cross. Then he kissed his mom's foggy photograph and, kneeling down, whispered, "Mommy, I love you very much." Watching the boy closely, Mr. Cobb caught himself thinking that pity for this little soul, deprived of maternal love and affection, had taken root in his heart. "What's your name, buddy?" he asked when the boy stood up from his knees. "Nicholas," he replied, wiping tears with the sleeve of his old sweater. "Come to me," said Mr. Cobb, standing up. "I'll take you home." Nicholas approached Mr. Cobb, and the caretaker took him by the hand. "Where are you going anyway?" Mr. Cobb asked. "I don't know," Nicholas replied. "I live with my stepfather, and he's drinking again. I don't have anyone else." "Don't worry," said Mr. Cobb. "I won't abandon you. You'll stay with me and Ethan for now, so don't worry." Nicholas obediently held Andrew Cobb's hand, looking at his mom's grave. "Mommy, don't miss me. I'll come more often." Mr. Cobb smiled and said, "Mom will never forget you. She will always be with you in your heart." After standing for a while longer, they headed back to the guardhouse, where Ethan greeted the little guest with surprise. "This is Nicholas," said Mr. Cobb, pointing to the boy. "He's homeless." Ethan looked at the boy and immediately noticed his sad eyes. "Don't worry," he said. "We won't leave you." Thank you, whispered Nicholas, smiling for the first time since they met. The elderly caretaker smiled at his new friends and felt a tear run down his cheek. His life had changed recently, and clearly for the better. After preparing a simple breakfast of a couple of sandwiches for the boy, Mr. Cobb turned on the old radio quietly and started listening to the news. At that very moment, Dorothy sat in the kitchen, sipping strong coffee. Truth be told, she didn't know what to do next, where to begin. Should she go to the police after all? But what would she say? That she heard moans at someone else's grave, or that she dug up the earth and found a coffin with a vagrant Aita inside? No, none of that would work, especially since Anne strongly asked her not to go. At that moment, Dorothy remembered her new acquaintance Eric, who used to work in the police force. Maybe he could help. Well, he must still have some connections or contacts. Taking out the business card with the taxi driver's phone number, she dialed the coveted digits. The phone was answered almost immediately. The taxi driver had been waiting for her call. After listening to Dorothy's hesitant story, he said succinctly, "Wait for me at the square in front of the house. I'll be there soon." He spoke with firm confidence and determination, which slightly surprised Di. When she met Eric, he listened to her without interrupting. There was not just compassion in his gaze. His eyes sparkled with some hidden understanding. "This Scott, he's rich, right?" he clarified. Dorothy nodded. "Yes, a big businessman. His name often comes up in various scandalous affairs." They wanted to bury a completely different person in the grave. "Overall, I'm not entirely sure if you can help, Eric, but I needed to tell someone." He silently looked at her and shook his head. He felt the worry that Dorothy couldn't hide. "I can try to find Scott," Eric finally said. Dorothy flinched as if from an unexpected blow. "Are you sure?" Her voice was barely audible. "Well, in this life, you can't be 100% sure about everything," Eric replied, standing up and leaning on his uncomfortable prosthesis. It was always difficult for him to trust people, but Dorothy was one of the few who saw him not as a burden, but as a normal person. "I'll try to find him," he said, "but I feel that this story could have a very unpleasant outcome." Dorothy nodded in agreement, and hope was evident in her eyes. "Thank you, Eric," she said, watching his departing car. Eric went home to gather information about Scott. He also needed the keys to his old apartment downtown, where he and his close friend Vincent had worked as a detective agency for some time. Moreover, due to his unfortunate condition, Eric was the brains of the operation, while his partner provided surveillance and gathered information. "Vinny, I need your help urgently, buddy," Eric said over the phone. "Oh, pal, glad to hear from you," Vincent replied. "What's going on with you? Did the world flood or something?" Weighing all the pros and cons in his mind, Eric told Vincent about Dorothy and businessman Scott Reynolds. "Listen, I quit the detective business," Vincent said, "but it seems I can't refuse you. What do you know about this?" Eric breathed a sigh of relief and immediately shared the information he got from Dorothy. "Well, this is getting interesting," Vincent said. "I have some connections in criminal circles. I think they can help find out where he disappeared to." Eric nodded. "I hope we can find out something after talking to his longtime friend." Eric felt much more confident. In addition, among his old things, he found a notebook with the phone number of one of his former informants. "Hey, old man," Eric began the phone conversation. "Are you still in business? Listen, I have a job for you." Yes, came the reply, "in repayment of the debt you never returned to me." "Well, okay. Who remembers the old times? Tell me, do you happen to know what happened to businessman Scott Reynolds?" There was an awkward pause on the other end of the line. Afterward, the informant promised to do everything possible for him, and even the impossible. Now casting his net into the murky world of crime, Eric had nothing left to do but wait. A week flew by unnoticed, followed by another. During this time, Dorothy not only befriended Eric, but also visited Aita at the cemetery several times. She even met little Nicholas, whom her schoolteacher friend also took under his wing. Learning about the sad story of the little orphan, Dorothy found herself thinking that she wanted to help him no matter what. Maybe I should adopt him. Oh God, he's such a lovely child, she thought, barely holding back tears. When else will I be able to have a child? Can I even have one? Time is running out, and then I'll always have a dear and beloved son. Discussing this idea with Mr. Cobb, Dorothy immediately saw approval in his eyes. "You've got a good idea there," he said. "And the boy is good, mark my words. He won't let you down in the future. I've started spending some of my free time with him, so I can say with confidence he's a potential prodigy, even though he doesn't realize it yet." Dorothy smiled and lovingly looked at the child. Meanwhile, Eric was completely immersed in his work. He checked all the information about Scott that he could find. He also personally met with Vincent, who passed on contacts from people in the underworld to help Eric find Scott. "Just be careful," Vincent warned. "These guys don't like unnecessary questions." Eric thanked him and went to meet one of them. His office was located in one of the most troubled areas of the city. The businessman patiently listened to his guest and then, never taking his eyes off him, said, "Do you really want to know what happened to this Scott? It's simple as ABC. This scoundrel ran away from his creditors to whom he owed a heap of money. Then Scotty was offered help by serious people abroad. He had no choice, you understand, so he decided to escape abroad and hide. To avoid being hunted down, he staged his own funeral." Eric looked at the man with doubt. "And that's all?" he asked. The businessman smirked. "What, not enough for you?" "I see in your eyes not enough. Well, okay, I'll give you a little more. Scotty Roll didn't run abroad for nothing. His father was found there, a rich man with huge assets. He had to flee persecution from competitors in the late 90s, and he left his 1-year-old son in an orphanage. There was no choice. His wife had died in a car accident. Where could he go with a child in his arms? In short, he was only able to find his son a quarter of a century later. Can you imagine? So he sent a special team for him. They had already arranged everything: the funeral, the fake coffin, and the commotion surrounding Scotty's death. Eric was astonished. He stood there, barely keeping his balance on his uncomfortable prosthesis. "Where is Scott now?" he finally asked. "Do you really think I'll tell you that?" The businessman replied, "You don't think I'll just give away his whereabouts that easily?" Eric sighed sadly. He had already realized that he wouldn't be able to learn anything valuable from this informant. "Okay, thanks anyway," he said, walking toward the door. "Don't mention it," the man said spitefully, "but I strongly advise you to forget about Scott. Believe me, he's not worth risking your life for." Eric returned home feeling deeply disappointed. After all, he hadn't been able to find Scott, although he had learned the truth about his past. That evening, he called Dorothy and told her everything. To say that Dorothy was shocked would be an understatement. With Scott fleeing abroad, all the threads that could help her regain her good name were cut off. To everyone else, she was just a failed doctor who ruined a patient's life. Dorothy's entry into the medical world had been canceled. The most she could hope for now was a nursing position in the reception area. For this, she had spent years studying and completing her internship, only to lose everything due to some elusive businessman's actions. And Scott wasn't any good either. Couldn't they have come up with something more legal? Why did his henchmen attack Eton? Why did they set him up, offering him a job in the funeral team? He could have died being buried alive. All of this made Dorothy's head spin. Scott Reynolds was the one who benefited most from this situation, waving goodbye to everyone and sailing abroad to his rich dad. Just the thought of it made Dorothy feel sick. But was that justice? What did Ethan suffer for? For nothing. Who would pay for his medical treatment after possible complications from a head injury? Right, nobody, because he was a homeless man, a person without family or tribe, someone everyone had turned their backs on and long ago written off. Only the thought of little Nicholas prevented her from sinking completely into depression. No, I can't give up, not now. I'll get all the documents sorted out, become his guardian, and then we'll see who wins. Dorothy whispered to herself as if casting a spell. It took her about a month to gather all the necessary paperwork and take the case to court. Of course, she could have done without it. But Nicholas's stepfather, Lucas, adamantly refused to give the boy up. Finally, the moment of truth arrived. Sunlight streaming through the blinds illuminated the papers spread out on Dorothy's desk. She rubbed her eyes tiredly, her face reflecting a mixture of concern and determination. Today was a very important day, the day when she had to fight for Nicholas, whose mother had recently passed away, leaving the boy alone with his stepfather. Lucas was an alcoholic, and Dorothy knew this firsthand. In truth, she had seen him drunk many times, heard his shouts, his cursing. Who knows what would have happened to the boy if not for Dorothy seeing him once in the cemetery caretaker's hut. She simply couldn't walk away. Dorothy talked to Nicholas and learned that his mother was often ill and the stepfather just drank, leaving the boy alone. She knew she couldn't let this child end up in the hands of such an irresponsible person. Lucas naturally went to court pretending to be a caring father, ready to give Nicholas everything. In court, he spoke sentimental phrases about how much he loved his son and that even when drunk, he never raised his voice. But Dorothy knew that wasn't true. She had seen the boy's broken toys and heard his frightened whispers. She knew that with such evidence, she had little chance of winning. But despite this, she had no intention of giving up. Dorothy remembered Nicholas's words, the little and unexpectedly mature words that touched her deeply. I want to live with Aunt Di. She's kind. In court, Dorothy came not only with documents and reports about the boy's health, but also with a desire to give him a normal life. She spoke of her love for children, her dream of creating a happy family that Nicholas had never had. Dorothy talked about the joy of guardianship over the boy and the opportunities he could have in the future. Lucas, on the other hand, looked greedy and malicious. He insulted Dorothy, accusing her of greed and wanting to steal his son. He shouted that guardianship wouldn't give Nicholas anything good, only restrict his freedom. But none of his arguments could outweigh Dorothy's sincerity. Her words came from the heart, and her gaze was full of love and tenderness. She wasn't just trying to obtain guardianship. She wanted to give Nicholas a chance at a happy future. Fortunately, the judge was on her side. He saw in her the sincerity and kindness that the little one needed. Thus the judge revoked Lucas's guardianship rights and entrusted Nicholas to Dorothy Briggs. At that moment, Dorothy was excited and happy. On the same day, she took Nicholas home, bought toys, and cooked his favorite dishes, macaroni and cheese with meatballs. Now her home was always bright, warm, and joyful. Nicholas smiled and called her Mom. He was home. He became a son again. Wiping away the tears, Dorothy realized that it was all worth it. She'd made the right choice, and all the efforts were not in vain. At that moment, she promised everyone who supported her in court, Eric, Ethan, and Mr. Cobb, that she would always take care of Nicholas and do everything possible to ensure he grew up in a happy family. Nicholas, in turn, became a real ray of sunshine in her home. Dorothy planned to visit all the interesting places in the city, build sand castles with him on the beach, and read him all the fairy tales in the world. Once during a walk in the park, Seeing children playing, Nicholas asked her, "Will you never give me back to that uncle?" Dorothy sat on the bench, hugged the boy, and said, "Never. Nicholas, you are my family. I will always be by your side and never leave you." At that moment, Lucas's words echoed in her head. "You will never understand what it means to be a father." Dorothy didn't know why he had said that, but she guessed an alcoholic would never understand what it means to be a mother, what it means to love selflessly and give everything for the happiness of a child. Meanwhile, she couldn't stop communicating with Eric and Ethan. Ethan, by the way, found himself becoming the caretaker of the cemetery. He pulled himself together, restored his passport, and finally reconciled with his parents, who all this time continued to live in the village and considered their son dead. This happened only when Mr. Cobb retired due to health reasons and finally reconciled with his daughter-in-law, who allowed him to see his grandchildren. Taking over the management of the city cemetery, Ethan, in a matter of weeks, proved himself to be a talented and tenacious manager. If Dorothy had purely business relations with Ethan, then she was increasingly drawn to Eric every day. Thanks to the help of the former police officer and the photos proving that the coffin on Scott Rimmel's grave was empty, Dorothy was able to return to work and clear her honest name. Acknowledging her mistake under the pressure of irrefutable evidence, the department head and the chief physician publicly apologized to her, restoring her confidence and belief in tomorrow. At Dorothy's suggestion, Eric queued up for experimental bionic prosthetics that were supposed to revolutionize the world of prosthetics. The young taxi driver volunteered to be a pioneer in this matter, to test the miracle of medical technology and make adjustments to the developers if necessary. As for Scott Reynolds, there was no news for about half a year. After that, he suddenly and unexpectedly returned to his homeland. Moreover, the controversial businessman came not alone, but accompanied by two foreigners of athletic build, who turned him into the nearest police station to make a heartfelt confession. As it turned out, a fatal mistake had occurred, and the relationship between Scott and multimillionaire John Skinner ultimately did not materialize. It's hard to say whether this was the result of any scheme on Scott's part or just a coincidence. For everyone who closely followed the situation, one thing was clear. Somewhere to this day lives a wealthy heir who doesn't even suspect the secret of his birth. Perhaps this secret would have remained unresolved if Mr. Skinner, sensing the cool breath of advancing age, hadn't mobilized all possible resources to search for his son. The scale of the search efforts was mind-boggling in its thoroughness and careful screening of potential heirs. Besides studying the archives of orphanages, John Skinner's trusted aides funded the renovation of several educational institutions in the region, equipping them with computer labs and new gyms. Unbeknownst to him, the mysterious heir helped thousands of little orphans who couldn't dream of such luxury. About 6 months later, the searches finally yielded a positive result. Finding the businessman's son became possible with the assistance of an international blood bank and donation center, where a DNA code match of almost 100% was discovered. Imagine the surprise of the foreign tycoon when he learned that his biological son was an inconspicuous taxi driver named Eric who had a background in law enforcement. Initially, no one wanted to believe it, thinking it was another mistake. Now everything will be clarified and there will be disappointment, they thought, as had been the case with Scott Reynolds. But when Mr. Skinner finally persuaded Eric to take a repeat DNA test, everything fell into place. They were indeed father and son with a 99.9% probability. Standing on his recently acquired bionic prosthetics, Eric cried, not believing his eyes. Was all this really true? He was the son of a millionaire. It couldn't be. He'd open his eyes now, and everything would disappear as if it had never happened. But this time, everything was real. Few knew that the future taxi driver's childhood was spent in an orphanage, where he had to fight for every morsel of bread. Yet none of the children complained, since they were fed quite acceptably at the shelter. And now Eric stood and looked at his father, being his exact copy, only much younger. "Forgive me, son, for finding you so late," Mr. Skinner whispered. Eric shook his head, then introduced his wife, Daddy and son. Nicholas. Technically, they hadn't gotten married yet, but who cared when two loving hearts felt like halves of a whole? Especially since the groom's father immediately spoke of organizing a splendid wedding, and the bride announced her pregnancy. Standing on his recently acquired bionic prosthetics, Eric cried, not believing his eyes. Was all this really true? He was the son of a millionaire. It couldn't be. He'd open his eyes now, and everything would disappear as if it had never happened. But this time, everything was real. Few knew that the future taxi driver's childhood was spent in an orphanage, where he had to fight for every morsel of bread. Yet none of the children complained, since they were fed quite acceptably at the shelter. And now Eric stood and looked at his father, being his exact copy, only much younger. "Forgive me, son, for finding you so late," Mr. Skinner whispered. Eric shook his head, then introduced his wife, Daddy and son. Nicholas. Technically, they hadn't gotten married yet, but who cared when two loving hearts felt like halves of a whole? Especially since the groom's father immediately spoke of organizing a splendid wedding, and the bride announced her pregnancy.